Welcome to the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association Zoom Layout Tour for May of 2022. Our guest today is Keith Jordan from Kansas City, and he is going to show us and tell us all about his layout.
Those of you of a certain age probably recognize that music as the Dragnet theme, which I thought is appropriate for Los Angeles. And this photo is an iconic scene, both for railroading and then, of course, the City Hall, which is buried by other skyscrapers once they figured out how to make them stick around for earthquakes. I'm going to talk to you today about the Patch, which is the name of my railroad. And we're going to go through the hows and whys of it, the industries that are there, how I operate it, the design process, and then I'm going to show you a film that kind of ties it all together. In this particular photo, we're probably on the bridge, I believe the 6th Street Bridge, looking kind of northwest towards downtown LA. And this is the First Street Yard, which was the main yard for many, many years until the Santa Fe moved out to Hobart. But this was still a lot of activity into the 50s. The streamliner train you see down there in the foreground is the San Diegan. So the area in red on the track chart shows the First Street Yard and kind of the general layout. And I've layered it with the photo again, just so you kind of get a reference point on it. But that's the yard itself, and that was the original yard of the Santa Fe. It had some pretty old facilities there, but it was the heart of the industrial area for the Santa Fe in Los Angeles. Here's an aerial view looking straight down. Now, this aerial view is prior to 1938. It orients itself that you can see the top of the yard there where it narrows down, and then you can see on the right-hand side on the back chart where that area is as well. So the industrial zones that are near First Street Yard are the three main ones are the Patch, the Canal District, and the North End. And I've got the question there that says, where did these names come from? Sometimes names on a railroad are named, you know, a lot of names occurred 100 years or more ago, and no one seems to know where the names originated. The North End kind of is self-explanatory because it's at the north end of the yard, which makes sense. The Canal District, we think, refers to where the freight houses were. That's where they were. They would be reminiscent with these long, long docks of canals. And hopefully you know that the Venice area of Los Angeles actually does have canals, as does Venice in Italy. So that's where the Canal District gets its name. The Patch, we're not really sure. I can tell you that it was used as early as about 1916 in a report. And we think it might have referred to the various pre-industrial truck gardens or the small patches of gardening that were in that area before it got developed in the early part of the 20th century. So just really don't know, but they kind of make for interesting names, and they become these railroad names, you know, used now 100 plus years later. Here's the freight houses in the canal. The two upper photos are the newest freight house. Metrolink was using that as a kind of a storage area, but you can see in the 1947 built photo, it was full of freight cars. The inbound freight house, there was an inbound and an outbound freight house that were just to the south of the 47 built freight house. And those buildings still exist. They're actually quite beautiful buildings. And these are artist studios and have been repurposed. One of the industries right next to the freight area is Penzick and Gordon. It's no longer that, but it was referred to as the West's largest toy wholesaler. So, you know, we can have a toy wholesaler on our toy layouts, which I think is pretty cool. And then you had Maxwell House Coffee. That was down near the foot of 4th Street Bridge crossing the LA River. Was built in the 20s. And the color photo doesn't show it very well, but the course, this is a curtain wall construction, but with the horizontal concrete members, you can see where it says Maxwell House Coffee on it, which is kind of cool rather than a billboard sign up at the top. But neat buildings, that's the main draw for me of this area, is all these really neat buildings. And then you have all these really cool bridges. There was a report that you can find online, which is the black and white drawings showing the folks that rehabbed all these bridges and made them basically earthquake proof. They have since torn down the 6th Street Bridge, and that's the one that's kind of iconic because it was featured in a lot of commercials that are shot out there. But all of these bridges are different. They all were built in the 20s and reflect the building styles of that time. Very, very unique that there's like 5 or 6, bridges crossing the river in about a 2 or 3 mile span, and they're all different. The 4th Street Bridge on the west side, which is over the 1st Street Yard, has what I call a swallowtail, in that it has a split entrance and exit to it coming together to cross over the rail yard and go across the river to East Los Angeles. It's again a really interesting building. That show's built in 1931. So, and this is what I consider iconic 6th Street viaduct or bridge. Again, I believe that has been totally replaced. They couldn't save it. The photo on the left shows kind of this ramp that goes down underneath, not only the bridge, but down underneath into the LA River. And some of you might remember this bridge because it probably was a mistake that they built this, because that's where the giant ants got in the movie Them in 1956. If you haven't seen that movie, you might want to look for it on Turner Classic Movies, because it's great. It has a lot of railroad scenes in it. But I always talk about the giant ants coming out. In fact, I've got a giant ant on my layout, so he doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't bite either. But one of the streets that I looked at when I started considering this area was Palmetto. And you can see from the photos, there's a lot of street trackage, which is pretty neat. And then in the last couple of years, I noticed that this building has been featured in some TV commercials. Then the other name that was a big deal in LA was Barker Brothers. They sold furniture, they sold white goods, they sold all kinds of things, and they had buildings and stores everywhere. And these warehouses are now converted to condominiums, kind of neat buildings, and have a real, industrial appeal to them. And then there was also this building, which was their furniture warehouse and store. And one of the things that you can see in the black and white photo is a dark area in the lower right corner. Well, that was where the track went in to load and unload in protected circumstances inside the building, which is kind of cool. Getting to the patch, you kind of wound around all of these buildings. This is a Sanborn map showing some of the industries and where everything is. So 1st Street Yard would be to your right, off the map, and then you kind of come down to these curves and snake around through the industries and in between the buildings. And I'll show you a couple more photos of that. But the aerial photo then kind of shows where the thing comes through. But you had Hills Brothers Coffee, you had the Star Warehouse, I'll show you in a few moments, and Nabisco and the California Walnut. So we'll talk some about that. This is the patch area from the air. And if you look right at the middle, you can see where the buildings curve, and they make a curve to the left and then a curve to the right, an S curve. And then they come down between the 2 series of buildings that are just to the left of the big gas holder. So the open tracks over to the left with the big white building are the LA produce area. And that would have been filled with reefers at certain days where they sold produce to the, all the downtown jobbers and things like that. This is the alley itself, the heart of the patch. Looking down the alley, the big building in the distance is LA Terminal Warehouse. That was their big wholesale warehouse area. But you can kind of see, even just for an alley, the tracks are rather complex. That's a 3-way switch there in the foreground in the black and white photo. And then the color photo, of course, is in shadow, but it's a little further down, but you can see it hasn't changed a whole lot. This is where you get into the patch or the 7th Street alley. This has since been kind of paved over, and the building on the right-hand side of the big photo is a restaurant, and you can eat in this alleyway now. But the little inset photo on the left shows the tracks going through there with the Santa Fe locomotive. And I was telling Burr this earlier, that the inspiration for the layout came from Bob Smouse. And Bob, besides being a terrific modeler, was the longtime garden editor for the LA Times, and wrote other articles. And because of his passion in trains, was able to go and shoot this in downtown LA, and then had this article about the train that goes through, these buildings to get to its tracks to work. And this was a feature in the LA Times weekend magazine. And at the time, my parents still lived in California, so they sent me the magazine and said, you might be interested in this, as they usually say. And I looked at it and remembered it. And several years later, when I got, to thinking about what should I do, this became the inspiration. So I was inspired by Bob Smouse for this. And he models downtown LA, but he's focusing on the SP side of things, which is only a few blocks away. This is at the top of the, if you go through those curved buildings previously, and this is be the first building, and they refer to all of these industries as houses. So the California walnut growers, of course, became the nut house, and was rail served. You can see the tracks down going through the fence, which is there erected to prevent people from going down there, because this is no longer served by the rails anymore. Nabisco had a big factory there, the West Coast home of Nabisco, which is kind of cool. And then you can see where it says Crackers and Brie, as they're referring to the condos that they built there. One of the largest buildings that's down there, the big building on the left is Nabisco factory. The big building on the right is the Star Truck and Warehouse. And this was, again, a warehouse that had a listing of maybe 100 people that had offices in there. They could be, selling light bulbs. They could be selling pretty much anything. And this was their offices. Trucking companies were here as well. And during World War II, this building was so constructed heavily with concrete that it was considered a bomb shelter. And today it's a very expensive loss, but later it became known as the toy factory, because there were a lot of toy jobbers that were in there, and they referred to it as the toy factory. But today it's pretty expensive loft apartments that you can have. Phillips Poultry is down on the alley. It's an interesting building because it's just really this concrete stucco box, but it has some really nice bas relief on it. And I'll show you what I did for this, but it's just kind of a neat building. And they would get cars of poultry in here, and then they would process and dress the poultry. Some of the other alley industries that were down there, I mean, again, this is just one alley, and you have all of these different types of industries down here. So it's made to order for model railroading. So things like a bag company, which made burlap bags, and then later grocery bags. You had a sanitary mattress, which I'm glad they named it that as opposed to unsanitary mattress. The Metro Hotel Supply was the name of basically a Swift meat house, what they called a branch house, where they would get meat and they would set it up and take the quarters or the halves of beef and pigs and things like that and cut it up into steaks and make it all for the local hotel supply, supplying the hotels downtown. You had a little steel manufacturer, Commonwealth Steel. You had a paint furniture company down there. And then the West Coast Banana was a banana warehouse where there was a train a week that came up from the LA harbor on the Pacific Electric, and then they would give it to the Santa Fe, and then the Santa Fe would switch the cars in and out of this West Coast Banana area. And they did it on a priority basis that a lot of times they would switch a couple of cars in there. The foreman would have his men at the West Coast Banana take and unload those cars as quick as they could, and then the railroad would take the empty cars out and put another couple of loaded cars in. So it was kind of a high priority thing for the railroad. So all of those sort of things combined to make me think about a neat layout. What could I do? And I knew I wanted to do an industrial type layout. I had a large layout in the basement at the time that was based on San Diego. And I kind of realized at that point that I wasn't going to be able to build that because it required too many buildings. So I thought, well, I enjoy industrial railroading, so let's build a shelf layout that's focused on that. And this was the space that I had to work with. The square space is about a 12 by 12, and then that's an extension. So that's about 15 foot down into that area. And it's my library. I had thought about putting this shelf layout on top of the long bookcase, but then the L space to the right actually had the outside corner, and I could build that curve in. So that's where the patch idea kind of germinated from that. So this is the area that I had. I'd taken a couple of just really snapshots just to show you that it's a fully furnished space. It reflects my interests, and it's the way I want it. So that was kind of neat. So my design goals in putting this together was that it had to be prototypical, but a small area to model. I only wanted 1 or 2 operators. Obviously, my area won't hold more than that, and I'm having operated at layouts where you've got 8 or 10 people, even as high as 20 people. Dealing with folks like that becomes a management problem, and I wanted to leave my management skills at the door. I just would rather just have fun with a couple of friends. Because it was in this finished space, not in the basement, but it's upstairs and in the space, the way it looked was pretty critical. I wanted it to blend in very nicely, so I did some things there. Also had to be able to build it because I couldn't do the work up here in this office. I couldn't use a saw or drills and stuff very much. I thought I'd have to build it elsewhere and bring it up here. And I wanted to have some modeling fun. I will say that just my personality is such that I tend to get into things on an intense basis. And when I was building the layout in the basement, everything had to be just right. Well, I loosened my standards up here and basically used Walther's buildings and things that I wouldn't have used, that I would have had to scratch build otherwise, and just had a good time doing it. And I just built it for me. So I loosened up a lot, but in some areas I adhere to some pretty strict standards. So this is what I came up with. This is the plan that basically First Street Yard is represented by a few tracks there, at the north end, as it were. Whatever trains work in this area begin and end there. They don't go off into staging. There's no staging on here. It's just the trains begin and end in the yard, and then go through the curved buildings there, and then you reach the alley. And one of the things that I had to think about with this is that if I were to build a true alley in the sense I had buildings on both sides, then you'd be, reaching over the top of buildings to reach the cars and stuff. So I got the idea that I would build the tracks out on the front edge. This is only 12 inches deep, and have, in essence, full-size buildings behind it, instead of just flats. And then the industries on the near side would be represented by some little tags, plaques that would tell you what the industry is. And it works very well, and you get the feel of an alley switching job. So that's the overall track plan there. And again, it's only 16 square feet. It's two 8-foot sections by 12 inches deep. And I was able to build these out in the garage. I built them of high quality wood, birch plywood. and I was able to, paint it, design it and paint it and do everything out there. So it was pretty easy to install for that reason. I also was able to lay track on there, wire it, do everything I needed to, make sure everything fit, which was really kind of nice and a lot of fun to do that. Even in a garage space, you could do it in the basement or wherever your working area would be. And then it just basically, you can see in the top right photo, I just screwed it to the wall with lag bolts. And because it's tied together at 3 points at each end, and then in basically where the corner is, it becomes very, very rigid. You don't need any cantilever or supports underneath. It's totally cantilevered, and it stands proud of the wall. And it's lag bolted to the studs, and it's not going anywhere. It's very, very, very rigid, which is nice not to have any kind of supports. I used Atlas Code 83 track, again, easily available. I used Caboose Industries in-scale hand throws. I modified them using little wire, cut off the tongues and shortened them so they'd fit in between the tracks, and makes it easy, and they work just perfect. So it's a very nice way to do things. So this becomes then my version of the patch. You can see the blue areas are painted directly on the wall. In the case of where we're looking right now on the alley scene, I actually painted, put a piece of hardboard behind it and screwed that to the wall, thinking that at some point I might actually try to use some photoshopping of the LA, City Hall and stuff for the background. Never have gotten around to it, but that's okay. But I painted the fascia is green to match the wall, so it really blends in and kind of disappears at the same time. But there, it stands out. It doesn't look bad at all. It doesn't look like, oh, there's a huge layout in the middle of the room. This is the First Street area. I had to deal with the sloping roof in here, which basically dictated, the height of the railroad, which is about 52, 56 inches. So it sits pretty high. I built the bridges. I kind of kit bashed those. The gray parts are from the Rick's bridges. And you can see from the prototype, there's some pretty fancy curlicues and things like that, but I was able to do that just by using some simple evergreen styrene, using some tubing shapes to create curves, and thin pieces of plastic to make other kinds of curves, and box everything in, which is nice. And then Walthers makes these really nice light poles that are lit and you can power them. I've not done that. I just simply made holders for them, and they just plug in so I can remove them if I need to. So that's the finished viaduct. The black area implied that the tracks go on, and I should probably put some sort of photo backdrop in there. And I do have some photos that would work, not to distract you. It is painted it black, so it tends to disappear. Because the freight house is a big deal down there, it's over 800 feet. I had to build the freight house, and it provides a lot of switching opportunity. And it was pretty simple. It's just, again, a stucco concrete building with a curved arched roof. I built it out of styrene. It's a single piece. Again, straightforward. Sort of took some measurements on from the photo and kind of guessed at what they should be, and it all worked out. And then I think the good folks at Blair Line made the freestanding Santa Fe sign, which is, was down there. And I remember it being lit up, and I think it was white, and it was bordered by red neon. So it kind of stood out at night. But anyway, got the sign there just like it is. Mine's, 300 scale feet long. So it's about a third of the size of the real one, but it's 3 feet long, as it were. There were these switch engine servicing facilities, and these are, to me, are always cool things to have. I found these drawings of it, and it kind of basically shows you how they were constructed. So I scratch built some of it. The sand tower is from American Models Limited, I believe. They make a plastic one which had all of the elements. So I kind of did it. You can see it there, and the two fuel stands and sand pipes or scratch built using some various cal scale pipes and things like that. And then later I found this really cool photo. It was taken by this guy, George Basinius, and he noted very precisely that it was made at 4 p.m. on June 5th, 1949. But it's a cool photo in that it looks the kind of away from the yard across the LA River or the channel. You can see the Alco switcher with the Burlington stock car, and that's on the main, he's on the main lines that are parallel the river. And then the facility is right in the middle, and that silver tank car is actually a sand car that the Santa Fe converted from these old tank cars, and Division Point makes a brass model of that, and I have one of those, and a couple of high hood Alcos. The railroaders referred to the Alco S2 series, or then that's mainly NS4s. They called them low tops, and then the high tops were the Alco HH 1000s. The 1000s actually came first. They were always kind of LA switchers. They used them up in San Francisco, some too. And the problem with the high tops were that they didn't have enough charging power to charge up the airlines for the passenger trains. So they kind of fell out of favor and went into freight switching, but they were small wheelbase, so they could get around the curves, and they were excellent for switching the industries. And then the Alco S2s kind of became the predominant switcher for the LA basin. So I modeled Penzick and Gordon again because it's iconic to me. It's a flat behind First Street, roughly where it is. I had all of the signage that you see here. The building signs were all custom made. I did all the artwork, and then a friend of mine had a silk screening process. He could make the decals for me using the decal sheet. So that's what I did, because I think the signage to me is something that you should try to replicate. A lot of modelers tend to use the decals that are available, and they don't always look right. Again, that's a typography thing that I tend to get into. But this was a Walthers building that was, I think, that REA Express building that I kit bashed two of them together as a flat, and it works out really nice for that building. And then, of course, you've got to do the gas holders. They were all over Southern California. I was able to fit mine in, used 1/2 of a Walthers kit, cut it in half, and then cut the frame so it fit the slope of the roof. And it looks just like, I mean, you kind of see that and you say, oh yeah, that's Los Angeles. Bridges, as I said before, I'm kit bashing those. I've got one area that I still got to build a bridge and just never have. So one of these days I'll get to it. So let's kind of walk down the alley and look at some of the bridges. I've got at the top of the alley, the Nate Starkman building. Again, that's a Walthers, the modular stuff that's put together, and that works out pretty well for the curve. And I replicated the Nate Starkman and Son signs. The outside spur is used for Nabisco. The curve itself, I used one of the Walthers downtown Merchants Row, I think, buildings for the home supply. And I never knew what that business was all about, but it turns out it actually, they were contracted to the railroad to supply uniforms and various things that the maintenance crews would need. So that was actually a railroad business, as it were. It wasn't rail served. The two curves I made simply by forcing the styrene into that shape with forms underneath and floors and stuff. But it's a tight curve, an 18-inch curve that goes around. Phillips Poultry, like I said before, it's kind of a slab building, but I took the time and effort to kind of carve the diamond shapes into the walls and highlight those with some paint, and it makes for a building that's otherwise a plain Jane, but it has a little bit of decoration. Commonwealth Steel is one of the Walthers buildings. I think it's the Valley Fruit Company that just kind of lent itself to being there. It was kind of nice. The California Electric Works is actually a building from San Diego. I wanted a non-rail served building that would look kind of neat and that you would find in there. I had found this building in San Diego in an alleyway and thought I liked the signage, so I did it. And then the Metropolitan Hotel Supply is the top of the Red Wing milling grain facility that you can get from Walthers. So I chopped it down and made a refrigerator door on it, a heavy insulated door, and a platform where you can spot reefers. Then the next one, again, was some of the modular stuff from Walthers to make Barker Brothers. The lettering I created and to replicate what you saw there. So again, it gives the flavor of it. The doors aren't right next to the tracks. They're pulled back so you have room for trucks and stuff. So stuff that gets on, it's kind of like a team track in that, you know, you would get unloaded with a ramp, or if there were forklift trucks, they would haul stuff out. And then at the end, I wanted to put in a building of some sort, but I wasn't sure whether it's going to be the Barker Brothers or the Maxwell House Coffee. But this again is a building from Walthers, and it lent itself to the Maxwell House. So I moved Maxwell House about a mile over to here and put it in with the track going underneath the building there, which is typical of a lot of the buildings in downtown LA. So it's the Maxwell House building, or Maxwell House Coffee building. And that's a Great Northern Reefer, by the way, down there, having delivered coffee of some sort. And then I took the, I think it's the hardware building from Walthers, and made a flat just to kind of quasi create the SP, or the former Pacific Electric Union Terminal warehouse. And you can see where the arrow goes. There's a section, a gap there, where I put street and actually put a couple of rails in the street. So the SP went down Alameda Street, which is, excuse me, what that is. I've got a caboose and a an SP locomotive there, you know, acts as scenery for that. And then of course, the ubiquitous little hamburger stand down in the corner there. So operating, the patch gets operated by two operators. One of my goals was not to have anything on the fascia of the patch on. I wanted that to be clean. So, you know, no car cards and waybills of that type of thing. And I wanted to use realistic paperwork, which meant that using switch lists and so forth, and a prototype car forwarding. The control is done with Easy DCC. And again, for this aesthetic thing, I wanted to have the control panel mounted, but you can see here that it flips up underneath, so you don't see anything sitting down. The booster and the receiver are all up inside the boxes, the framework, so you don't see anything at all. With this command station, I built a plywood frame using some European hinges, which kind of facilitate it going up nicely. And then I also put the receiver, of course, it has an antenna on it, so that pokes up through the gas holder. And I just hope there's not a spark with this antenna, otherwise the whole place is going to go up. Working the patch. As I mentioned before, the high hood, the high tops were the regular power. The Santa Fe had a few of those. There were 3 tricks, and I got a hold of the job numbers, which is kind of cool to know these job numbers. And there's a method to their madness I'll show you in a second. It could be considered switchman's paradise or nightmare. One of the stories I was told by the old timers was that they had a foreman on the job who was basically the head boss of the switching job, and he was new to the job. So it was critical that everything get lined up properly, because you didn't have room to work down in the alleys and so forth. So he got them all lined up, and then they got down there and they found he had got them all lined up totally backwards. So he did not come back to the job. They would not let him come back. But in a night on a job, they could handle 30 to 40 cars because they were switching multiple places. And they used the rip tracks down in First Street Yard as kind of the initial sorting yard, which is kind of interesting. But as I said, the high tops were the locomotives that they used, and they were ubiquitous. And I kind of think they're cool for us modelers in HO. The only problem is that they're available in brass, an old Hallmark, which requires a lot of work, or these Overland Models ones. And I found out that they only imported about 35 of each number. So there's very few of those around. These are sound equipped. They've got that Alco sound, and they're pretty cool. The job numbers that I mentioned were tied to the zone numbers, which each of these zones, the North End or the Canal District or the Patch or many, many others in that LA area, all had a number assigned to them. And the method in LA, which was, I think, true for all Santa Fe, was that any jobs in the 100 numbers were daylight jobs, meaning that they started in the morning and went to the afternoon. The 200 series jobs were the evening jobs that worked 4 to midnight. And then the midnight jobs were the 300s. The way they did it in Los Angeles is that jobs 122, 222, and 322 were the 3 different tricks, 8-hour tricks that worked the patch. And then those destination tags, these are all the prototype tags, and the clerk would actually staple these to the cars. And you can see on the bottom 3 pictures, they tell you where these things go. So they're in essence a car card. And so I've replicated those, and that's what we use to move the cards and know where things go. So you can see in the bottom photos that the car that he's carting, and it's called carting the car. And these are photos from this movie that I'm going to show you here in a few moments, that this car it goes down to somewhere between Fullerton and San Diego on the 4th district. And it tells you what it's loaded with. It's peaches, and it has the car number on there. So the clerk in the yard is just writing that information down on a switch list. I made up all of these car cards, and these aren't attached to the cars or anything, but they tell you, okay, this car is going to this area. And it tells you, it gives you the initials, the number, contents if you want. Most of mine have contents, and then the destination. So let's say in the patch, you might be going to the banana place, and it would say, bananas on there for contents, and then it would say Southwestern Produce or Southwestern Banana, whomever it's going to. But I had these made up at a local office supply. I've cut them up, and they're cards about 2.5 inches square. And so the crew actually sits down at the table I'm sitting at right now in my office and works up a switch list. So all he has to do when they go to work and they go over here to the patch is that they just have a switch list in their hand. All the stuff stay in the box, and they don't have to mess with them. So some of the sessions I had, I enjoy having them, and I would just sit back and photograph and watch them when they were working, which was kind of fun. So here is the bonus part. This is a little short film. It's about 10 minutes long. It was filmed in Los Angeles, around the patch, around First Street Yard. It does have some San Bernardino scenes. Best I can tell, it's around 1953. It's an informative film. It was probably aimed at grade school folks. It has some really cool freight cars, and it's a very informative movie because it basically tells you how they did it. So let's sit back here for a few moments, for 10 minutes, and watch this film.
Here is the freight yard of a big city. Nearby is the engine house with the big diesel engines that pull the freight trains. Here are the engineer and firemen who run one of the diesels. They are going to the freight yard with their engine to couple on to the cars they will pull today. The cars are waiting on track 18. They are loaded with lots of different things. They will go to many different places. It is the railroad's job to be sure that the cars get to the right places. A big part of the job is putting the freight train together or making up the train. The Work begins almost as soon as the freight cars are loaded. Here is a factory that makes can ends. Some of the cans are loaded right into the boxcars. Every day, a man from the railroad comes to the factory to see how many cars are loaded and ready to go. He is called an industry clerk. He gets a paper called a bill of lading for each car that tells how many cans are in the car and where the car is to be sent. Then the industry clerk puts a numbered card on each car. The card is like the address on a letter. It tells other railroad men where the car. This is called carding the car. The industry clerk also looks to see that the doors are properly closed and sealed. Then he goes to other companies and puts cards on the loaded cars they have. And he picks up the bills of lading that tell where the cars are going. There are other industry clerks working in other parts of the city. One day they card a great many cars, all kinds of cars, flat cars, box cars, hoppers, tank cars, gondolas, carrying everything you could imagine. When he is finished, the industry clerk brings all the bills of lading to the freight office. Now, the railroad needs to bring the loaded cars to the freight yard. This is a job for the switch engines. They move the freight cars around in the city and in the freight yard. A man at the freight office writes the orders to tell the switch engine crew where the loaded cars are. The switch engine crew gets the orders, goes out to pick up the cars. Modern switch engines have two-way radios. While they are out working, the yardmaster's office calls to tell them about more freight cars to pick up. When the switch engine has a load of cars, it takes them back to the freight yard. Now the cars must be sorted out. All those that will be in the same train are put on one track. Another switch engine does this job. It pulls the string of cars to the switching track. This man looks at the cards on the cars to see what train each car belongs in. He makes a list that tells where to switch the cars. The switchman uses this list to sort out the cars. In this yard, cars for the train going north are switched on to track 8. Track 14 is for cars that will go south. The train going east are put on track 9. But this is only part of the job. At the other end of the yard are more switch engines. They put the cars together in the order they will leave the city in a long train. Here are all the cars that are going east. But some of them are to go to different cities than others. So they need to be separated and grouped once more. This time, all the freight cars that are going to the same city are put together on a separate track. This is called blocking the train. Here is a model train that shows how a real train looks when it is blocked. Now the blocks are put together in one train. Cars go to the city farthest away are put at the rear end of the train. Cars to be left at points a little closer are placed in the middle of the train. Cars that go to nearby places are put at the front end of the train. In this way, as the train goes along, the cars can be quickly switched or set out from the train without disturbing the rest of the train. Now, let's get back to the real train. When all the blocks are put together in proper order, one track, the caboose is put on. But before the freight engine gets here, there's a lot of last-minute work to be done. The blue flag is put on the train as a warning that men are working around the train. The inspectors hook up the air lines of the cars in the train. Then the inspectors check the air hoses between the cars to be sure they are all connected. Air pressure is used to work the train's brakes. The wheels and axles are inspected to see that everything is in good condition. This man with a walkie-talkie radio on his back walks along the train and reads off the numbers of all the cars in the train. The man in the freight office listens and writes down the numbers. Boxcar 146-742. Then a list of all the cars in the train is typed. It tells where each car is going and what it contains. The freight papers or way bills for all the cars are put with the list. The list is called a wheel report. It is for the conductor, so he will know where all the cars are to be delivered. He is in charge of the train. This is the rear brakeman on the train. He is making his own inspection of the cars. Now, here comes the freight engine. The blue flag is moved up to the engine. The engineer cannot go until the blue flag is taken off. When the engine air lines are connected to the cars, the engineer makes a brake test. First, he applies the brakes by moving the brake valve. Young men walk along the train to see that all the brake shoes are tied up against the wheels. Then the engineer releases the brakes. There is another inspection to see that all the brake shoes are away from the wheels. The inspections are all over and everything is all right. The engineer gets his orders from the conductor. The flag is taken off and the train may go. There's the high ball, the signal to start. The engineer pulls the throttle and the train starts to move. The head brakeman rides in the cab with the engineer and fireman. Conductor and rear brakeman ride in the caboose. Soon the train is out of the yard and on its way. Back in the freight yard, the switch engines already are making up another freight train.
That film is I really like it because it's got a lot of information in there. I want to point out a couple of things about it, though. You'll notice that some of the engine sounds they had were Alcos, but they applied it to an EMD locomotive, which was interesting. Some of the crewmen on the ground, the way they're dressed in the 50s, you know, with the wearing chinos and in long sleeve shirts. And of course, everybody's got a hat on for the most part. But I also like the fact that the rear end crew on the freight leaving town, they were wearing Hawaiian shirts. I haven't been able to find any prizer figures with Hawaiian shirts, which I think would be kind of fun to have. The fellow that was in the movie, the clerk typing away, he was dark haired. That's a fellow by the name of Bob Drenk. And I met Bob. He was a clerk for the railroad for all of his life. And you know how we tend to glom on to the engineers and the conductors, tell me what it was like working on the railroad. I've actually learned more about how the railroad operated back then from Bob than any other person. And he was a clerk for all of his life. But he knew those phone numbers. He told me about how those things work, how they get the information back and forth. A lot of good information. Some of those rail yards, or the rail yard, of course, was First Street, but some of the engine house facilities and the trains leaving at the end and everything were at San Bernardino. And Bill would have noticed the pre-cooler in the background on the one couple of photos there. And then the train was, of course, headed up Cajon. So they were kind of talking like all this is right next to each other when it's about 60 miles apart. But anyway, that's a pretty cool film. And some of the folks that I do want to thank for helping me put all this together: Don Richardson, Matt Zabrowski, John Signor, Bob Smouse, the late Andy Springo, and a name you may not always recognize, Miklos Rosa, but he wrote the theme to Dragnet. And of course, we've got to thank the city of Los Angeles. So with that, we're going to exit out of here for about 40 seconds with a little bit of music and some images that you might remember. All right, there we go. I'm open for questions.
I was fascinated by how many images were in that film of that center cab switcher.
Oh, I know. They use those for
Switcher too.
transfers.
Yeah, I hadn't seen a movie of that before. That was really interesting.
Yeah, they had I don't know if all three of them were down there in LA that the Santa Fe had, but they used those for transfer jobs back and forth to the other railroads, which is kind of neat.
I'm just curious, when you talked about your little operating sessions, how long do they last?
All the sessions typically run almost 3 hours, which is an 8-hour trick, pretty much at a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. I forgot what the ratio would be, but they're all about 3 hours, which is about how much time you want to spend running a railroad.
And how many cars roughly do you think get moved during that?
I've got about 30 some odd or 40, somewhere between 30 and 40 on the railroad. Not all of them get moved at any given time. And the other thing that I do is I do run the 3 different jobs. So one session might be the 122 job, and that does certain things. And then the 222 does certain things but are different. And then the 322 does certain things and are different. So they not everything gets done all at the same time. It's always kind of rotates around a little bit.
Can you operate sitting down, or is it too high for that?
I do have in essence, a bar stool in here and a lot of times the engineer will sit on that, and because he can sit right at the corner and kind of see down both ways, and then the conductor moves around. So, but it's not designed for sitting per se.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was an extremely interesting presentation.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate everybody's attention. Bill, I appreciate you kind of bugging me to do this. So.
Well, thank you so much. It was even better than I'd hoped. So just fascinating.
Oh, well, good. Glad everybody did it. And I always, I'm a ham, so I always enjoy an audience.
Yeah.
Thank you, Keith. Job.